I'm Scott Langford. I'm a professor of English at Foothill College, and this presentation is being co-hosted by Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month at Foothill College. Mae-lee has been a very frequent guest, but we're also co-hosting with Stanford's Global Educator Network, of which I am part of the board of directors. So we're co-branding this with Stanford and Foothill College. I'm here today to introduce and interview Professor Mae-lee Chai from San Francisco State University. She has been a lifelong journalist and award-winning author of fiction and nonfiction, and she is a proud and active public intellectual who speaks out on a wide range of issues, including anti-Asian hate speech and violence, which is, alas, our topic today. And in fact, Mae-lee, having come to Foothill College for many other events in the past, welcome back, Mae-lee, we did decide that because this is so much in the news now, and in fact, since I follow Mae-lee Chai's social media feeds, I know that she's been on many a radio and television program lately, addressing exactly this topic. So partly what we want to hear about is what has that been like to be on these talk shows and to try to address what is only the latest wave of anti-Asian hate speech and violence. And I'm just going to close before I let Mae-lee begin her presentation by saying that both she and I would triple emphasize the sad and tragic fact in American history that anti-Asian hatred, anti-Asian violence is nothing new. It's essentially as old as Asian immigration to this country. I know that from writing a book about Lake Tahoe, which was an epicenter of anti-Asian hatred, being an epicenter of the Transcontinental Railroad. But I also know it from a lifetime of reading authors of history and fiction, such as Professor Chai. I will, in fact, hold up one of the several books that I've used in my own classes. This is a book about Cambodian American immigrants. This is the second in a series called Tiger Girl. Mae-lee Chai is not Cambodian American herself, Chinese American, but it grew out of a very early experience that she had, I know from previous interviews and friendship. So it's a long story, not only in American history, but in Professor Chai's own life. So welcome back to Foothill College, and welcome back to the Gen Channel, Professor Chai.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Professor Langford, it's always a joy to speak with you and to visit Foothill and talk for AAPI Heritage Month, although the topic today is grim. But thank you for asking me to talk about this because it is something that's critically important and it's ongoing and it's accelerating right now. So I put together just some little slides so students will have something to look at just to kind of introduce this topic. So the latest report was released today by Stop AAPI Hate, which is an organization that is keeping track of the hate crimes and hate incidences all across the United States. There is actually no state mechanism here in the state of California to keep track of this, which is interesting, which is why Professor Russell Jung over at San Francisco State, as well as his co-founders, started to put together this website in order, because they anticipated when the pandemic hit in March of 2020, that there were going to be incidents of increased anti-Asian violence and bias, just because the former president at that time, President Trump, was using hate speech in his daily briefings. And he was saying the China virus and the Kung flu. And so he was equating Chinese people and Asian people with the pandemic. And we know that he was not responding to the pandemic in a responsible way. And so here we are today, more than a year later, and we've had 6,600 incidents of hate against Asians and Asian Americans reported across the United States, and just 2,400 of them were reported just between January and March 31st of this year. So it's actually accelerating. And then, so in responses, I started noticing a lot of incidents back in February of this year. I mean, there were some sporadic acts of violence and hatred and name calling last year, but it really seemed to accelerate this year. And I noticed the media was not framing it very well. The police are very cautious on how they categorize a crime and a crime and criminal investigation. So they weren't calling these attacks against Asians hate crimes. And yet we were seeing all across the nation and in the Bay Area increases. So I started this Twitter thread to just start collating them. And this was back in February, around February 7th. And so, for example, when 84-year-old Thai grandfather Vicha Ratanapakdi was shoved and killed in San Francisco, I thought we had reached a turning point where the level of violence and the way Asian seniors were being targeted. And I felt a critical moment that we really needed to start speaking up. So I put together a viral Twitter thread of current hate incidences and anti-Asian hate throughout American history. And that went viral and had like more than 7,000 people share it. Then on a week later, I appeared on the Culturally Relevant podcast out of Seattle. And that is a Chinese American podcaster, David Chen. And he hadn't been hearing in the media about all of these incidents. So it's like really important to start speaking up and start getting the community across the country involved, because the mainstream media really wasn't covering it. And then I wrote, and then after the murder, the mass shooting in Atlanta of 8 people, including 6 Asian women, I wrote an op-ed for the LA Times because, again, the mainstream media were not actually seeing this as necessarily an anti-Asian hate crime, even though 6 of the 8 victims were Asian women. So I wrote this op-ed, How Asian Women Are Relentlessly Objectified in American Culture. The New York Times, you may remember, that week on their Sunday paper ran a front page story on the killer, on the white killer. And they said, oh, evangelicals feel his anguish, because he had said, oh, this isn't, anything to do with bias. He said that he killed the women to get rid of temptation. Well, I'm sorry, as an Asian American woman, I am not here to tempt you. I have a right to live, And so then one of the things I wrote about was when I was teaching in North Carolina a few years ago, I was actually profiled by the police. And they came and knocked on my door one day, and they said a neighbor had called and said that they thought I was trafficked. I was a trafficked person, and they thought they'd heard screams coming out of my apartment, which is completely false. And so they wanted to come in and look around, which was really scary and also really weird to think that just by being an Asian woman in a, predominantly white apartment building, I could be seen as a trafficked sex worker, and the police would be called. And so after I wrote that piece for the Los Angeles Times, to start getting hate mail, because this is what people do. And so one of these people said, more Asian women are killed outside of the United States. Therefore, when they are killed in the United States, it doesn't count. And then so, he's got some misspellings, and you are Asian and inscrutable. And there's some obscenity, but I don't record that for you. But just to show that there's pushback across the nation. When we speak up, there are people who will resist this. So then I joined in with an intersectional talk with other women of color at Book Passage in March. And we talked about issues of just how women of color are objectified and silenced, and we face violence and many of these types of issues in the United States. And so just you can see some of these images. And I just want to show, in contrast, this was a panel that a Bay Area independent bookstore put together, run by a Black woman moderator. Meanwhile, on national news, NBC Meet the Press, they also had a segment focused on Asian American hate crimes. And as you can see, this is their moderators. They had no Asians on it. So independent bookstores for the win. They do a great job. And then I appeared with Professor Russell Jung on the local public radio station to talk about the historical context of AAPI hate and how, from the Oriental Exclusion Act in 1882, or the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, laws in the United States have been enacted that are deeply racist against Asians. And then it was expanded to 1888 so that Asian immigrants were not allowed to become naturalized US citizens. They weren't allowed to have land. They couldn't testify in courts against white people who might have attacked them or committed crimes against them. And beginning with the Page Act in 1780, Asian women, specifically Chinese women, were mostly banned from immigration because they were presumed to all want to be prostitutes, which is a fascinating enactment of law and prejudice. And so then this just shows our bios. And then I also appeared on the special report for Areva Martin, who is a legal analyst for CNN. And we talked about the rise of Asian hate crimes and specifically the murder of the 6 Asian women in Atlanta, which was still being not called a hate crime nationally. And then earlier I had written, to show another article, remember when Kamala Harris, our current vice president, was just beginning to campaign for vice president, and the Republicans were making fun of her name? And I just thought that's the most Asian American thing ever. Like, here's a Black and Asian woman, and they were saying, Trump was saying she didn't have the right to run because she wasn't a US citizen, even though she was born in Oakland, California. We have birthright citizenship. She is absolutely a US citizen. And someone was making fun of her name and saying, deliberately mispronouncing it. And so I wrote an article going into, basically the Asian American experience of always being asked, where are you from? Where are you really from? And not being accepted as Americans, even when we are Americans. And so then I just want to talk a little bit about activism. It's not something that should only come up when we're actually dealing with like a rash of hate crimes. And so here's some images from my family background. My father was in the 1988 Democratic National Convention in Atlanta as a delegate. I've written books about this subject. There's a picture of me and my dear friend, the late great Iris Chang. And then also I'll show a family portrait. This was my very first political rally. This is me down there with my mother and my brother in Chinatown in New York City. And, there's so many ways to get involved. So you can attend rallies, you can write creatively, you can write as a journalist, you can write op-eds, you can form student groups. I formed my first Asian American student group when I was in college. And then here's, there's social media sites that give advice and they give training. For example, ihollaback gives free bystander training and also free training for Asian Americans and people of color who are experiencing bias, like how to protect yourself. And then here's an example of like what to say when you hear someone saying something racist or doing something. Like what can you do to interrupt the flow of that kind of hate speech? And then also I want to remember, because this is AAPI Heritage Month, it's not just about stopping Asian hate. We also have to remember to celebrate Asian and Pacific Islander joy. We can uplift Asian and Pacific Islander artists and businesses and support our communities and to recognize our accomplishments. And that all helps to reduce the hate crimes and the hate incidences and the hate speech. So that is, I will stop sharing. And that was just the little images I wanted to put together for everybody. So there's something to look at.
Wow, thank you so much, Mae-lee. For my Foothill audience and really for everyone, I want to add a personal anecdote because you were talking about how this came more and more onto our radar over the last year, the pandemic and the election. And so I wanted to mention that I was at an event very much like this a little over a year ago. It was in April, it wasn't in May. And several of my most valued colleagues, full professors at Foothill College, without thinking that this would strike me quite so deeply, mentioned that they were afraid to go into a grocery store in the Bay Area, and they wore their masks and pulled their hats down over their eyes. And it just really shocked me because it also means it's even someone with the privilege of a professor, and even in what we would like to think of as the bubble of the Bay Area, there is no safety. And it wasn't just one person, it was several of my most senior and respected colleagues. And it shocked me. And I've heard you also speak of this as well, like what you have witnessed and been subject to in San Francisco. So I really want to put a marker in for those of us that are in the Bay Area to say that the illusion of safety in the Bay Area is exactly that. And I think it's part of the, I mean, I don't like to say, but I say with great privilege, as in white privilege, with great privilege comes great blindness. And I have not been afraid to walk into a grocery store in the Bay Area, but this was clearly and remains something that people think about every single day, in the same way that women have to, you know, I'm a male and I don't have to carry my keys in my hand going out to the car thinking that someone might attack me. So for me, that was the moment when I felt a kind of shift in my own consciousness about this, as well as what we've been witnessing in the media, as well as what we've been witnessing, what we've been hearing in our politics and everywhere else. So thank you for shining a light on this. It's a terribly painful subject. I was cringing through every slide that you showed, but
Well,
that's
thank you.
what's going on.
Yeah, but thank you for bringing that up. I really appreciate that. The majority of reports to stop AAPI hate have been from the Bay Area.
Oh,
And I believe I mean, and many people believe it's because it's underreported elsewhere, right? At least we do have Asian American and Pacific Islander media here. And because we are 30% in San Francisco alone, Asian American and Pacific Islander, there are some news stations that cover these issues, and we have Asian American newscasters. So they also cover these issues. I think in other parts of the country, as I don't necessarily know that Asians there are safer, it's just not getting reported. And that's really terrifying. Richard Louis of MSNBC has stated that the underreporting could be up to, like, there could be 2 million incidences, they think, based on what has been reported, and just thinking about like how many typically would be underreported then. And then, yeah, I mean, I've had to report 7 incidences alone just for myself and my father to stop AAPI hate. And yeah, I had an incident in a Walgreens in which I thought I was going to be beat up by somebody way back in March of 2020 because of mask wearing, and so someone didn't want to socially distance and they decided to take it out on me. And then, you know, I have also had to report an incident where my father and I were walking at Ocean Beach in San Francisco, and a white man came charging at us, and I thought, oh my God, he's going to try to shove my father. And my father's 88 years old, he's disabled, he walks with 2 canes. And so I was like, if this man shoves him, there's no way I'm going to be able to stop it. It was terrifying to recognize. But we made it safely back to our car. And the man was shouting, you know, at my father, lift those legs, you can lift them, lift those legs. And he was like really delighting in the terror he was causing. And then he was shouting, can you understand me? Because I wasn't talking back to him. And it was a very startling moment that revealed to me, you know, our vulnerability. And there were other people at the beach that day, but they just didn't see it. It was windy, they couldn't hear. And so now when I go out with my father and I take him for a walk, he cannot go out anywhere alone. I carry pepper spray, I carry a personal alarm, and I carry a miniature air horn. And in case, you know, we have another incident like that, I'll be able to make a very loud noise, and I'm hoping other people would be able to hear it.
well, I'll share another story because I think this is also, it's important for students. I have not spoken to a single student of Asian ancestry, Asian American or international student, who can't verify what you're saying in their own life, you know, if not to them directly, to their family members. So once again, I just want to emphasize that the Bay Area is not safe. But I also want to say I actually currently, as you know, happen to be out caring for my 88-year-old mother in Denver, Colorado. And I grew up here. This is my hometown. I know that you were a reporter in Colorado for some years. That's one of the places that you launched your career. But in all of that time, I had no idea that Denver, and now I think stupidly, of course, I mean, connect the dots. I wrote a book about Chinese American, I wrote a chapter about Chinese Americans on Lake Tahoe. I know this, and I know that I talked about it, but in my consciousness, I never thought Denver had a Chinatown. And so I was walking downtown 2 years ago, and here's this tiny plaque on a wall, a brass plaque, you know, about 2 feet by 2 feet, that says this was the site of the formerly burgeoning Chinatown in Denver, Colorado. And of course, you know why I grew up thinking there was no Chinatown. Because in the 1870s and 1880s, it was methodically burned to the ground by white supremacist terrorists, right? And that's true in virtually every town in the Western United States. So if you think you grew up in a town that has no Chinatown, if you're not in Mountain View, if you're not in San Francisco, and you're anywhere where there were railroads, where there was fishing, where there was a lumber industry, where there was an agricultural industry, you're wrong. And the invisibility of it is something that was created by whites, like literally by white supremacist terrorists. I'll just add one more little, you know, the historical fact from Tahoe. The governor, the second governor of California, for whom Lake Tahoe was originally named Lake Bigler, and it remained officially Lake Bigler until 1946 or 7 on California state maps. And Bigler ran on precisely the same platform. It was an anti-Asian platform, and he specifically said that Asians were bringing quote unquote disease, and the Chinese were bringing quote unquote lust and uncleanliness. And that is exactly what that little mass murderer kid in the East Coast was saying, and the police, again, not connecting the dots, right? So like for for a century and a half, this slander and this lie has been used to justify acts of white supremacist violence nakedly and without apology.
And you know, and to just jump off your point about Chinatowns, and the reason why there were Chinatowns is because that was supposedly the only safe place for Chinese. They weren't allowed to just live anywhere. They weren't allowed to homestead. They weren't allowed to have farms. They weren't allowed to live in other parts of any towns or cities. So they would band together into usually like a couple, you know, very crowded streets, or even sometimes just a couple buildings. And even that was seen as threatening. So the irony, and then and the ironies of that being erased from history is interesting.
Well, I mean, I guess I should add, and again, I know you know this history well, but I don't think the average Californian knows this. Asian Americans and Chinese immigrants in California, when their Chinatowns were being burned down in the 1870s, in the 1880s, filed the original civil rights cases in this country. And that still stands as case law in the United States. So in many ways, the origins of legal remedies and legal remedies under the 14th Amendment, et cetera, date all the way back to incredibly courageous and incredibly smart pushback from the Asian American community using the legal system to try to shield themselves from this white supremacist terror.
That's another thing.
Not always successful, but they stood up and they fought back, and those case decisions are still cited to this day.
It's why we have birthright citizenship, because Wong Kim Ark filed a lawsuit in 1898, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. He was a Chinese who had been born in the United States. He was Chinese American, and he had tried to go back to China in order to marry, because again, Chinese women were not allowed to come to the United States. So if he wanted to, and he wasn't allowed to marry outside his race, so the only way he could get married was to go back to China. And then they didn't want to let him back in to his country of his birth and citizenship. So he had to file a lawsuit, and that was what established birthright citizenship for all the rest of us by that precedent. One of the first lawsuits for desegregating public schools was the Tape lawsuit in 1920 in San Francisco, in which a Chinese family wanted their children to be able to go to public school, because back in the 1920s or 19-teens, that was not allowed. Why do we have a Chinese hospital in San Francisco? We literally have a hospital called Chinese Hospital because it was segregated back in the day, and Chinese people, i.e. any Asians, were not allowed to go to the white operated hospital. So the Chinese had to band together and build their own hospital. And even though they had had Chinese traditional herbalists and medicine doctors, they were not allowed to practice. The state of California passed a law banning Chinese traditional acupuncturists and doctors from practicing. So again, the Chinese community had to pool its resources and actually send an American-born Chinese American student to a US medical school in order to practice at Chinese hospital. So I mean, there's just so many examples of codified racism that Asians have had to band together to fight against and to overturn. And it has established legal precedents that all of us unto the present benefit from. What's interesting is how this history of activism is also erased. Just as the
Yes,
crimes are erased, the history of activism is erased.
exactly. In fact, two more markers for the, for the Bay Area, for the Bay Area, Cesar Chavez's greatest political allies were Filipino farm workers in the fields, and they were tremendous
Joseph
allies.
Itliong was the Filipino farm worker who first organized the Delano grape strike, and he actually reached out to Cesar Chavez and said, "Hey, will you join with us? We've got this group going." So I mean, not just allies, but some of the founders of the farm workers movements were Asian immigrants and Asian Americans. And as you
Yeah,
wrote in your book about Tahoe and the origin, I remember your talks about California history. Think about all the white Western environmentalists who looked down on the Chinese field workers back in the day in the Central Valley of California. And even though it was Chinese who were working in the cherry orchards and working with like just really dangerous like arsenic that was used for as a pesticide and digging the irrigation system, so extremely heavy labor, and yet at the same time, the white men who owned these lands and benefited from these lands and then wrote about this history, not only erased them, but also pushed for laws to make it harder for Chinese and other Asians to immigrate to California.
well, and at last, two of those names would have been John Muir, who I wrote my dissertation about, and John Steinbeck, California's still most famous writer. As you know from the chapter in Cannery Row and the recent controversy, not recent to me, about John Muir. In fact, here's another fun fact that Foothill College does not like me to talk about, but we had to remove a large amount of topsoil at one point during remodels on our campus. And the reason is that the soil had a heavy arsenic concentration. Now, why? It had a heavy arsenic concentration because back many generations, it was the great fruit orchard basket of the nation. It was in the Valley of Heart's Delight. Long before it became Silicon Valley, it was a fruit growing and vegetable growing capital of the United States. And who were the earliest farm workers? Chinese Americans. So who was out there spreading arsenic on the crops for John Muir in Martinez in the North Bay? Chinese Americans. Who was spreading the arsenic in the South Bay? Chinese Americans, not exclusively, Filipino Americans also, Latin,
Japanese Americans.
Japanese, but precisely, and arsenic was the #1 pesticide prior to the invention of DDT. And it had the same absolutely catastrophic environmental racist consequences that we're still seeing today when people of color are the ones applying these toxic, hideous pesticides to the crops that we grow here in California, with all of us benefiting. So we're on the same page. Now, I need to get us back. I would like to turn us back, because you know me and I know you, we can talk about the history part forever. But of course, the still shocking part to me, I think this is part of being a part of white privilege, is that you get to sort of pretend that, oh, well, that was then and this is now and we're over this. And boy, has this year proven to me that yes, this is nothing. This is not only goes back centuries, it is still right here in our face, both the racism and the very proud legacy of anti-racism within the Asian American communities. Both of those things, alas, the hatred and the violence is alive and well. but the strength of the pushback, including Foothill De Anza graduate Ethan Lowe, who represents us in the California legislature, who's been absolutely amazing, including the president of our college, right? Thuy Nguyen. And Thuy has been out there, President Nguyen has been out there for us, representing Foothill College at dozens of anti-violence, anti-hatred rallies. And hooray for her, hooray for Ethan. So the voice of Foothill De Anza has been really powerful in this.
So just piggybacking on that, because I do know over the years, so many of your students and the fantastic work that they're doing. I just want to say some few things like, students now could be, even in lockdown, even under these situations, could be doing really good work that will benefit the community. For example, one could keep track of what you're doing in your daily life. This may seem really tedious, but a pandemic journal, the things you're experiencing, the things your family experiences, don't let the erasure go on for another generation, right? Keeping track of this information is critical. There's all types of Zoom events, and now that we're getting more vaccinated, there's going to be, there's been rallies and outdoor areas where the community can come together and speak up. There's, journalism that students can do. I know that Foothill was starting a student paper. And this is, I started writing for the newspaper in my town when I was a teenager. And so I learned those skills of interviewing people and responding quickly to a news event. And in fact, you mentioned my book, Tiger Girl, which is about Cambodian Americans and the kind of prejudice that they face, that first generation in the 1980s coming to the US. That stemmed out of my interviews that I did as a teenager in my town in South Dakota. A Chinese Cambodian family moved to our town, opened the town's first Chinese restaurant, and they faced tremendous violence. This was the 1980s. Someone threatened to burn down their restaurant. There was a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment. Like right now, there's a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment. It doesn't matter if you're Japanese, it doesn't matter if you're Chinese. If so long as you look even vaguely Asian, this type of hate spreads and you can be, can be attacked. And so they were attacked in that era. And I had interviewed the mother for the town newspaper, and she told me, the experiences that she had, of losing her children under the Khmer Rouge. And she had, I promised her that someday I would tell this story. And eventually they had to sell their restaurant at a loss and leave because our town was so threatening towards them. But right now, students, you're living through an interesting, shall we say, historical moment. You may think, oh, I'm just a student. Does my voice matter? Your voice does matter. Your voice is the critical voice. What you're experiencing, what you're feeling, write it down, keep a record or keep a video record. This is what's going to change history. This is what's going to change how people see this moment, is the records you're keeping right now.
Yeah, and I just want to reemphasize to students that are listening in, you're listening to someone in Professor Chai who, like, this was her life. As she said, she started at age 16 as a cub reporter in a little town and uncovered stories that the newspaper there would not let her publish, right? And so to this day, she's been breaking through the sound barrier time and time again, and as a fantastic advocate, as you see, for our students and her own students as a creative writing professor at San Francisco State University. So it's like, this message is real. It's not just it's not just a pep talk. Like, she has lived this, and I just, part of me wishes that you could be over it. It breaks my heart in a way that here we are decades later, and it's, well, let me ask this question, because I think this is a hard question, Mae-lee. Are there differences today? Like, because to me as a historian, so much of it sounds exactly like Lake Tahoe circa 1878, or like the anti-Chinese riots that carried on all through the early 20th century, or like what was, like what the Filipino American farm workers in partnership with Cesar Chavez were fighting back against. Cesar Chavez, by the way, having pivotal experiences as a teenage adolescent in Mountain View, California, which is one of the few places that still has a semi-standing Chinatown, right? So what, do you have an answer for that? Have you thought about that?
Yeah, I have actually. I mean, I'm writing an article that's coming out in a week or two called "Enough is Enough," and it kind of goes into just my own, like, just the generations of dealing with this type of anti-Asian racism and hatred, and saying when do we decide as a society that this is enough, right? Because it's going to take more than just Asians speaking up, or Asian Americans. It's really, we're going to need the allies. We have to do this intersectionally, and with racism across the United States, right? I mean, we're a nation founded on genocide and slavery, and that was, goes back to its very origins of a nation. And so this is an intersectional battle for the humanity of minoritized peoples. And so all of these battles we need to be fought intersectionally. And I think together we are stronger, and we are the true majority, right? If you put all of us together, we are the true majority. So, but we're not necessarily the most powerful in terms of money and influence, but we can use our numbers to push back against those with the most money and currently the most influence, right? We can take back our democracy. So I have optimism. I mean, like, why? Because I'm not dead, right? I mean, like, I would say the difference between the 19th century and the 21st century is maybe the sentiment and the yellow peril feelings pop up really quickly, just as they did in the 19th century. But we haven't all had to retreat into two buildings on one street somewhere, right? There's been enough pushback. We have enough allies. We have enough resources. The rights that our ancestors fought for still exist, and those rights do protect us with birthright citizen, the right to be educated, the right to be together in a classroom space and to talk about these issues. These were legal rights that people had to fight for and sometimes they didn't benefit it, right? They had to use all of their resources, all of their money, and by the end of it, like the Chinese family, the Tape family, who pushed for integration of Chinese schools, they actually ended up living in poverty towards the end of their lives. It didn't directly benefit them or their children, but for the next generation, the next generation, and the next generation, it has. So I would say that it is better because those rights that were fought for still exist. But it is alarming and depressing how quickly the hatred can be reignited at a national level. And a lot of that had to do, I think, with our previous president, who really used his bully pulpit, which we now see is so powerful, right? It's actually causing a lot of nativism and anti-Asian hatred around the globe. There's been anti-Asian acts of violence and hate speech all throughout Europe and in Australia and in Canada and in South America. And we sometimes, when we're in the United States, don't have a sense of the cultural power and the soft power of the United States. So when you have for 4 years a bully in the White House and the full power of the American media amplifying his hate speech against all kinds of, again, minoritized peoples, against immigrants. Remember his hateful speech against Mexicans, build that border wall, like making up, these really disgusting solutions for normal human activity that people have a right to come to the United States and seek asylum. We're signatories to the UN Charter, which says that we agree, the United States of America agrees that people have a right to seek asylum here. And pretending that is false and saying this over and over in the media, and then blaming people because of their ethnicities or because of their national origins or because of the origins of their families gets amplified globally. And so it is a scary moment. I will be honest, it is a scary moment, but I still believe that together, intersectionally, all of us, we can fight this successfully.
Well, and again, to lift up and amplify the amazing anti-racist history. I mean, that UN Charter was signed in San Francisco. It was written and signed in San Francisco. There's another plaque there for that, right? Foothill College, first Asian American college president in the United States, period, full stop. Bernadine Fong, right? Who's still working in the provost office at Stanford University and still fighting the good fight over there. First Vietnamese American college president in the United States. Our current president, Thuy Nguyen, yes. So we have, like, even right at Foothill College, we have an amazing, intense, nationwide heritage of leadership and courage in these areas. And we need to celebrate it and lift it up because the other side is still there. So we need students to know the history of anti-racism as desperately as we need them to know why that history matters, which is that this racist history is old and strong and deeply rooted. And even as you were saying, I mean, you know, our most recent past president amplified this, but that's exactly what Bigler did. That's what Warren Burger did. Warren Burger, the famous Supreme Court justice, was the Attorney General in California who led the charge to intern on essentially concentration camps the Japanese Americans. And he rode that to the governorship of California and then, thank God, reversed course when he was elevated to the Supreme Court. So it's bizarre that the man that we
Guilty
think of
conscience.
was that, yeah.
He had
like,
a guilty conscience.
Well, you know, but again, the history of anti-racism for me, especially, you know, speaking as a white guy, right? Speaking as someone who was raised in segregated Denver and segregated San Francisco, like, we need to know that it doesn't have to be a life sentence, right? So I actually find the Burger story incredibly encouraging. I mean, I hate what he did when he was governor and attorney general, but it was not the end of his life. It was not the end of his political career. And thank God it wasn't, because it's a hateful and hideous legacy. His legacy as Supreme Court justice is almost intensely the opposite. And it's interesting that then in one man, it embodies that possibility.
And also, it is, as you say, it's because of the work of anti-racist activists, right?
Yes.
You know, there were, like, when we talk about the internment, there were also Japanese Americans who resisted.
Oh,
and, you know, Fred Korematsu, he was born in California. And he says, you know, I'm a US citizen. I shouldn't have to go to an internment camp. This is my rights to personal liberty are being infringed upon because of my ethnicity. He took it all the way to the Supreme Court. They voted 6-3 against him, which was a decision that was only overturned in 2018.
That's right.
But still, people speaking up, having allies. He couldn't have got it to the Supreme Court if he didn't have, you know, non-Japanese American attorneys, because everyone else was in the internment camp, right? So he had to have allies who worked together and amplified that voice and got it out there. And then other people like Ansel Adams went, and the famous photographer, and he took pictures, for example, at the Manzanar internment camp. And he was very clever because in some ways they were propaganda photos to show, oh, look how well and happy the Japanese Americans are. Not like, oh my God, they've been forced to evacuate in the middle of the night, in buses with the windows blacked out, on trains with the shades pulled down so they didn't even know where they were going. And, you know, and they could have been going to death camps for all they knew. It was terrifying. But he went there and he was not allowed to photograph the guards with guns. He was not allowed to photograph the guard tower. So he came up with an idea and he says, you know, if I could get up really high, I could get a great shot of the camp. And so they allowed him up onto the guard tower. And he took a picture from there. And because he's up so high, it implies the presence of the guard tower that he himself was not allowed to take, directly. So there's ways that one can continually resist and record this history. There were activists within the camps who organized strikes, like Paul Ueno, who was a World War I veteran from Hawaii. He was sent to Manzanar and he says, I'm a US veteran. You know, why is my loyalty to the US being questioned? This is absurd. He organized a strike of the Japanese American workers within the camp. And then for his pains, he was caged and then transported from Manzanar in the middle of the night in a truck through the desert to a different camp. so we couldn't organize. But it just still shows, it shows people did not go gently into that good night. They were not enjoying this. This is not summer camp. It was great suffering. It was tremendous fear, and there was tremendous resistance.
Yes, so much so that, I mean, he also showed human beings, and he didn't.
Yes.
Another photographer might not have. I mean, the humanity still shone through, and that was a kind of anti-propaganda wrapped in what was sort of propaganda. Interesting. I hadn't thought of it in quite the ways that you just described it. Now, I have taken up more time than I usually like to in these meetings, because I would love to hear from any of the audience members. We currently have you muted because, to be perfectly honest, in the world of 2021, Zoom bombing happens. And so we have to be a little bit careful. So there are two ways that you could ask a question. One would be to type your question into the chat and I will read it, or Mae-lee Chai can read it. Or we can unmute you and you can ask your question verbally. So if you have a question, let us know. I think you maybe should start by typing the question into the chat, and then we'll see if you want to read the question or have me read it. And then while we're waiting, I don't think we have any in the chat at present.
Can people type it in? Oh, someone did. Okay.
Yeah, somebody. Yeah. So this is Daniel. Daniel, I could unmute you. I sort of know who you are. Or I could have Rick unmute you. Let's see if Daniel wants to ask his own question. I have to find you. I'm not. This is where Rick's good at this, and I'm not. Rick, are you there? Can you do that? Rick may have to head.
I just unmuted him.
Here's Daniel. Okay, here, hold. So here we go. Daniel, you are invited to unmute. And now you're unmuted.
Okay, yeah. So my question was, what are some things students can do, like, to help stop discrimination against Asian Americans?
Well, thank you so much for this great question, Daniel. There are a number of things that you can do at every level. One is, if you see the media erasing these incidences or these crimes, or when they report on a story and they center like the white killer, write a letter to the editor or put a comment on the article so the newspaper can see it and say, why is this person being censored as opposed to the Asian American victim? And you could also, if you feel like it's not being covered enough in your local paper, write to them and let them know you would appreciate more coverage. Other things you can do is, like that graphic I showed on my PowerPoint, is speak up. You can be a disruptor. When people say like, oh, this is caused by the blah, 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 or I remember in the very beginning, people were saying that COVID was started because of what Chinese people were eating in Wuhan. Totally disproved hypothesis, racist hypothesis, again, used to dehumanize people. There's ways to just say, I don't believe that, or where did you hear that? Rather than just being silent or laughing along. If you ever witness, God forbid, an act of violence, there's ihollaback training. I can put that in ihollaback training. These are free training sessions that are offered online, and you can go to their website, ihollaback. And I don't know if it's .org or .com, you can see, and sign up for one of their bystander trainings. And they give you really good tools so that you don't want to get hurt, right? And you don't want to cause it to escalate. But there's ways, for example, if you're in public and you see someone harassing someone, you can pretend, you don't have to necessarily attack the attacker, because then that can escalate, but you can pretend to know the person who's being harassed. Say, hey, how you doing? Because often bullies won't attack someone if they think they have a friend nearby. So that's, a strategy. There's other strategies. Nationally, there's a lot of heated rhetoric about US and China being enemies and being in conflict. And every time a newspaper or an organization uses this type of xenophobic language, again, you can speak up and write to them and let them know that you don't appreciate this hyperbolic kind of language of fear rather than analysis.
Yes, and I will add that if you're not Asian American yourself,
it's equally, and in some ways even more important, to speak out when the media mischaracterizes things. Like, I was writing to CNN and saying, what in the world are you doing without a single Asian American commentator talking about this issue? It's incompetent and it's embarrassing. Or that National Public Radio, CNN, were going with the perpetrators' excuses for why they did this and reporting it as fact. And again, I was like, I teach journalism. I was like, hello, I'm a college journalism teacher. If my students did this, I would have them in my office in 5 seconds. I was writing to the omnibus person in NPR to say, how can you use this language? You need to say it was alleged by the perpetrator that he did this for such and such. And just because the chief of police is incompetent enough to fall down that rabbit hole doesn't mean that National Public Radio needs to fall down that rabbit hole. But we need to challenge that language and when we see it. And I do think it can have an impact to somebody, and you've worked in journalism much more extensively than I have, Mae-lee, but it makes a difference whenever, if you write that kind of letter, it's not just, hey, I was mad about this. It's like, hey, you're not living up to your own journalistic standards. Like, this is not competent, objective reporting it, and particularly as a national news outlet, you can't let it happen. I know that my colleague, Professor Lin, would like to ask a question. So, if you are unmuted, you can ask your question.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. Thank you, Mae-lee, for being here today. I just love hearing the conversation between the two of you. I can just keep listening and listening. I'd be that fly on the wall listening to you both. But first of all, I want to, Mae-lee, I wanted to know, you said you're working on an article. So 2 questions. One is that you said you're going to be writing an article called Enough is Enough, and I'm wondering where that's going to be published. And my second question is that I saw that, I love the images that you showed at the very beginning. And I saw that you were a little girl, right? And with your brother and your mother. I was wondering where that was, and then how your parents got you kind of saying, this is important, let's take my kids here. Because I had the opposite, where it's like, be quiet, be silent, don't make waves. And I'm just wondering about your upbringing and how your parents infused that in your brother and you, it seems like. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much for bringing this up. One, the article Enough is Enough is going to be in Zora magazine. And it's so wonderful. I'm so honored that they're publishing it. It's run by a Black woman editor, and she has decided specifically to run a series of articles on anti-Asian violence. And so that's why she is publishing my article. And that will be coming up in a week or so. And I can send the link to Scott, and he can send it to you in case you're interested when it's finally published. And then in terms of activism, it's really interesting. I had dual experiences with, like, that rally when I was like 9 years old was in New York City, Chinatown, 1977. My father was the first chair of Asian studies at City College of the Harlem campus. And the first ethnic studies program in the country was at San Francisco State, formed in 1968 because of the student strike, the Third World Coalition strike of intersectional students coming together and demanding ethnic studies at San Francisco State. And then the second such department was founded in City College of New York back in the 1970s. And my father was the very first chair, was hired there in 1973. And so my father, as a political scientist, and he came to the United States as he was a refugee from China after World War II. And he came to study at college in the United States as a refugee, and then was able to get sponsors for his family. And so he studied political science. And so my father was always very active. And he would talk about these issues. And City College of New York City back in the 70s was a site of a lot of activism and a lot of intersectional activities. I think the rally that I was at was actually for Percy Sutton, who was one of the first Black mayoral candidates in New York City back in the day. And he had reached out to the Asian American community and, most mayoral candidates in New York City did not.
Mhm.
So there was a big rally in Chinatown to support him. So in my early years, I had a lot of encouragement to think about civil rights and to think about these issues. In my public school in New Jersey, when I was in elementary school, you know, they actually actively talked about this in the curriculum. People I know in California are very worried because the legislature has just mandated that we're going to have ethnic studies classes, you know, K through 12. And I'm like, yeah, it's about time. Oh my gosh, I had that in the 70s. And it doesn't make you hate your country. It makes you feel empowered. It makes you feel happy as a kid. I remember feeling so optimistic as a child in the 1970s with, you know, all the different movements that were going. I remember being shown a film in 5th grade saying that in the year 2000, gay marriage will be legal in the US. I mean, and where else was people were talking about this in public schools? And then the 80s hit. And boy, that was like hitting a brick wall in terms of this optimism. So, I mean, that Reagan was elected, then these kind of national conversations ceased. My family moved to South Dakota. There was nothing like that in my public school, the exact opposite, in fact. And so, you know, we go through these periods of activism and optimism in the US, and then we go through these kind of very regressive reactionary periods. But we can push back.
Yeah, and I'm putting into the Ed, I'm putting in right now for you and everyone else. Last year at this time, I think it was last year. It might have even only been 6 months ago. But anyway, the last time that we interviewed Mae-lee Chai, we quite specifically talked about the experiences with racism and anti-racism in her own family, and she's done extensive writing in both fiction and nonfiction about this. So another way to find out more about what she thinks about this topic is to read many of her award-winning books and articles. And also this, I think this interview, we had a wonderful talk today, but we had a very intense discussion. It was a year ago now, I'm remembering it was a year ago in April. So that might really be worth your while, since this is something that really interests you, because the genesis of this voice that of a public intellectual that I look to in my own life. I mean, Mae-lee, I've said this to you many times, like you really do, you inspire me, and you've helped me find my own voice in many ways. And I know that you do that for many, many people. I've been in your classrooms, I've watched what happens with your students, particularly your students of color, particularly marginalized students, first-gen students. So if you've been able to teach yourself to do this, it's partly a family legacy from your amazing father who's still fighting the fight. But it's also something that you've been able to pass on to other people. And I think that's something for all of you students to think about too. Like what will the next generation and the next generation think looking back about you? Did you stand up for them? Were you a voice for them? And how did you use your power? How did you can vote in California. You have a voice. You're college students, you have a college education. So use the light sword. I guess is what I would like to say. And I'm putting the link to the previous interview, at least to an intro, and then it'll get you to the Stanford Gen channel in the chat if you're interested. Do we have any other questions? Rick, I wasn't paying enough attention, so I don't know if we have other questions typed in.
Thank you so much for that very generous statement, Scott. I appreciate that. Just want to say I have taught Professor Langford's book, Tahoe Beneath the Surface, in many of my classes, because that is a great intersectional, very fast read. It's just beautifully written, but it's also a fun read that really brings in all these historical issues in literature and in environmental history, and just this ways different ethnic groups have had to suffer in these different periods.
Okay, and now I see a bunch of hands up, and I just have to get to be a little faster on my, let's see. Saintra, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. I'm gonna ask you, you can unmute.
Hi.
Question.
Hi.
You will be next.
Yeah. Sorry, I can't turn my video on, so you can't really see me, but I am first generation Vietnamese American. Both my parents are immigrated to California from Vietnam. And I just want to say thank you so much for sharing, because honestly, this whole year has been like a really huge learning curve To be honest with you, I didn't know what social justice meant. I didn't know what it involved. I didn't know if it, involved me, it involved, Asian Americans. I just never grew up with that. I didn't grow up with activism. And so, it's, I guess right now, the way I'm participating is by learning, because I've learned so much from your conversation together. And one of the, when hate crimes started happening with Asian Americans, I received a lot of, texts from, friends that were concerned and asking me like how things are going. And to be honest, it's something that I haven't really taken the time to think about, like to really think about, like, of course I'm upset, of course I'm angry, of course I'm sad. And I tell them that, I'm honestly just trying to process it. And I don't really know exactly how to process it, especially, if you are involved in, in activism, and you deal with this and you write about this and you hear about this. And for me, I'm like, I've had to really limit the amount of news that I watch, because every time it just really takes a toll, especially after, the murder of like the Asian American women. My mom, she works in a nail shop, and my parents are in their 60s, and my parents already, my dad's really paranoid about the, getting sick in general, because he's old, and then on top of that, he's Asian. So it's like that double fear. And I don't know, I'm telling, like, just don't listen to the news, because at some point it's so overwhelming. And I'm just like, I guess I'm currently dealing with how to process it, and also be more involved. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on it.
First, I'm going to say, well, thank you for sharing this, and thank you for sharing your family story. I really appreciate that. Two, do not feel that you need to push yourself. Surviving this moment is the most important thing you can do. Surviving, mentally healthy, physically healthy for you and your family. If we don't survive, we're not going to be able to do anything, right? So survival first. Two, I think that Foothill must have some counseling sessions available. I know at San Francisco State, we have what's called Aspire, and they've been providing, like forums and Zoom forums, just for Asian American students to kind of just talk about it and process it, because there's a lot of grief, right? There's just tremendous sense of grief and anxiety with dealing with these attacks, and protecting our parents and thinking about, their dreams, being dashed. And so you absolutely, it's fine to protect yourself in this moment and not have to just be under that barrage of news. Writing and processing your own feelings, that's part of activism. So someone just put psychological services and personal counseling at Foothill College is available as well.
Right, and we have a session coming up at the end of the month with our psych services staff as part of the API Heritage Month activities. So if you look onto I'm scrolling now to see if I can find it quickly, but we do have some other panels that specifically deal with mental health and maintaining your mental health in the face of not just the pandemic, but there's the pandemic of the virus of COVID, and then there's a pandemic of hate. And I think in both cases that you've got, as exactly as Professor Chai says, you've got to protect yourself. You have to protect those around you. And then I think, to maybe hopefully not stretch the metaphor too far, that learning about the courage of others helps vaccinate us. Courage is also contagious. And that's a really important point in our African American Heritage Month activities. I learned a phrase, I think it was a couple of years ago, and I love this phrase. I quote it to myself all the time. Old African wisdom that my fear was loud, but the voices of the ancestors were louder. And I find in moments of real fear that I if I listen, I can hear that in myself. So I think it's something to hold on to there. Now we've got another hand up at least, I believe. I know we're running long, which I apologize for. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, hold on, let me. Oh, well, I was going to start my video, but I guess you can't.
Oh, what were you
It's been
doing?
disabled.
Yeah, well,
What?
I guess we didn't know you wanted to do a video. What did you want to do, Caitlin? Can you help me out
Oh, no,
again?
I just wanted to
Oh, you mean
introduce.
you wanted to unmute your video? Yeah. I think, let me see if I can do this for you. Hold on. I have all these powers that you don't.
Okay, I did it. It's okay.
Oh,
You
okay.
could.
Can
you
you
should be able to
unmute,
show
can you
your.
unmute her video, Rick? Thank you. There we go. All right.
Hi, Mae-lee. I just wanted to say thank you so much for this talk. I had actually watched your conversation with Scott last year on my own time, some bit ago, and it was just really inspiring and empowering in such a time like this. I remember I had attended a different college before, and a moment that really stuck out to me was when this guy, this person that I was talking to, we were in the same like dorm hall, and he just happened to say, "Wow, you're really into American culture," and that just made me feel so othered. And I didn't know what to do about that, and that's obviously before COVID and before everything happened, but it's something that had really stuck to me as like I didn't realize I was
Not American. Hey, here
yeah,
you are in the US of A. Well, you know, fancy that, being part of American culture in America.
yeah, really affected me, and I don't know. Sorry, I'm studying my words. I just like I just admire how much you've done for the Asian American community in raising their voices and for everything that you said today. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Caitlin, so much for sharing this, for your sharing your experiences and your thoughts. And you know, if you ever wanted to write that experience down, you could also be sharing that and, you know, recording it, because this is like one of the like near universal experiences of Asian Americans, is being othered and being, as Professor Lin put in chat, the perpetual foreigner. We saw that with Kamala Harris as she was running both for president and then as the vice presidential nominee. So again, like, enough is enough, right? You know, at some point this has got to end.
Right. And I had never considered myself a minority, or I had always lessened my hardships because typically Asian Americans or people of color like that aren't.
We're seen as the model minority, and we're not allowed to have problems. And if we have problems, we're told to shut up and put up, right? Because our problems shouldn't count. I mean, this is a known thing.
Yeah.
Asian American studies, this is a known trope.
Yeah, I like that. So that's been put up.
Thank you so much, students, for your questions and your comments. Professor Lin. Mae-lee, I'm not sure if you have more time. This is always, we always, when Professor Chai and I get on a Zoom or even just chat, we tend to run long, and I don't think that either of us regrets it, but I know that many of you are here, you know, as part of your education, and you have other obligations to family, to classwork, to work, and etc. At the same time, Mae-lee, if anyone wants to ask any more questions, are you still available? Or
I am. I can.
Can you wrap up? You're all right on your side?
Yeah, I'm doing okay. I could go a little bit longer. So thank you for
Okay, so
asking.
if anyone wants to, I'm not right now, at least I'm not seeing more questions in the chat. And so I'll start sort of moving towards wrapping up. Please feel free to, please do feel free to ask more questions, to raise a hand. And I've been making these shout outs once or twice before. If I was in Colorado, or if I wasn't in Colorado, if I was in my home in the Bay Area, I would be able to reach on my bookshelf and pull out 4 or 5 of Professor Chai's books, several of which I've taught, and then others that I've read and wanted to teach and haven't gotten there yet. But I do want to say that everything that you hear in her voice in person is there on the page. And she's a multi-award winning author, as a journalist, as a fiction writer, as a nonfiction writer. And so if her voice reaches you, then then I do think that you would be well served to find your way to some of her titles. In fact, Mae-lee, this is a nice compliment to you. My building manager here in Denver, Colorado is Cambodian American.
Oh.
And, so we get to chatting, you know me, I can't shut up. So we get to chatting and this kind of comes up. And I kind of gently started saying, well, I've taught these books that were about Cambodian American immigrants and, my friend from San Francisco, and she seemed quite interested. So the reason that I have this book is that it's sitting, waiting for her to finish Dragon Chica, which I only gave her a little bit a while ago, and she really was so moved. I think, you never know. You've had this experience as a professor. You give someone a book, and it's a little bit like cooking for somebody. Like, what if they don't like chocolate? Like, what if they have a peanut allergy? I don't know what. But anyway, I could tell that it really mattered to her, and I think it would matter. It would matter also to you. And it's also, by the way, speaking of anti-racism, again, this is Mae-lee's book about Cambodian Americans, and she's not Cambodian American. She was given almost the burden of the story of people that she grew up with and carried it and then turned it into this beautiful thing. A year and a half ago at Foothill College, Dr. Cornell West was speaking from our own stage, the same exact stage that James Baldwin had spoken out in 1969. And he said something that, I quote to myself almost every day, that artists confront crisis with creativity and courage. And that is very much what I believe you have done with your life. And it's a beautiful thing to do, but it's also a beautiful thing to teach. And so I think both of us want our students to confront this crisis with creativity and with courage. I see that Caitlin has a hand up, which is great. So Caitlin, I think we can either, you're muted now, but I think we can unmute you. Hold on a second. And let's see, how do I do this? Ask to unmute. Might be Rick that has to unmute. Rick might have had to give up on us because he has other.
I unmuted.
No, sorry, you just needed, who did you need to
Oh,
unmute?
Caitlin Coe is back for another question, Rick. Sorry about that.
Okay, hold on.
Yeah. Oh, I was using the wrong scroll down menu to get to the unmute. So.
Hello?
There we
What's
go.
happening?
We can hear
There
you.
we
Okay.
hear you again.
I got
Caitlin.
muted and then I was muted again. I didn't know what was happening.
Yeah. Well, that's the way you're living in the era of Zoom bombing. So unfortunately, that's not
That's
a knock
right.
on you. That's like the times in which we live. So go ahead. You had another question, I think, right?
Oh, right. First of all, thank you, Professor Lin, for writing that. I feel really heard. That's it. I really appreciate it. My question was, how would you recommend one to start writing about their experiences like this? I know you mentioned a little bit about just like writing everything down, but maybe if there was a way to be more structured with it.
Sure. First thing is write down as much as you can remember. That's your source material, right? So if you think about structure, sometimes it can stop you and it can prevent you from writing because it just seems like such a burden. So first thing, write down your feelings, write down what you told me, write down that incident where someone says to you, oh, I didn't know why you're so into American culture. Write down how you felt about it. And then from there, you can think about how you want to structure. Like you use that raw material and you can actually build this in multiple ways. You can turn it into a personal essay. And there's a lot of both literary journals and newspapers that are looking for these types of personal essays. So if you live in the Bay Area, like the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Jose Mercury News, there's the Bay Area Times, whatever town you're in might have a paper as well. Send them as an op-ed. It's your personal experience, and you can think of a title that either ties into the latest incidents, because there's always a latest incident, or just in favor of Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, right? Also, if you listen to public radio, KQED, they have you heard of their perspective? They have someone, you can look on their website, KQED, And, people read a personal essay, very short, and they say, it's my perspective. And you would say your name and you can submit to them. And because I think your perspective is very relevant for what's going on just in terms of the news, and because it's AAPI Heritage Month. So there's just ways to get it out into immediately, like this month and the next few weeks, as a kind of personal essay op-ed. Now, if you're thinking of, I don't know if you're a creative writer, if you're thinking about turning it into a story or the seed for something longer, again, you can start thinking, putting more and more kind of memories and ideas together, and then start thinking about like how you'd want to build that as a moment for a character to go through some type of change. Because believe you me, like I first interviewed that Cambodian family when I was 15 years of age. And I made that promise that I would tell the story. And then it became, my mother said, don't put it in the newspaper. People have been threatening them. They're threatening to burn down their restaurant. And so I couldn't. So it haunted me. But the thing you write now, you can develop in years to come.